Nice to see you all. And it's a lovely day out there, and we've had a little bit more time to contemplate. I've been able to have a few more drinks. And so I still think that the Churchill quote, which I sent to you, is a good one. But Mark Twain famously said once, "If voting made any difference, they wouldn't let us do it." So, I thought that I would just mention before we started, on December 5th at 4:30 at the Life Sciences Center, OSHA is presenting a panel. What just happened? I don't think we'll know any more about that. And what's next? And the panelists are Phil Rucker, who's the national political correspondent for the Washington Post, Jim Ruttenberg, who is the media columnist for the New York Times, Brendan Nyan, who's good morning, everyone. Brendan Nyan, who's a government professor here at Dartmouth and who contributes to the Upshot blog of the Times. And I'm very pleased that I've been asked to moderate that. And so this is an unashamed plug for the event. And I hope that you will perhaps consider, it's a Monday, 4:30 to 6:30. And of course, admission is free.
What is the subject again?
Well, it's basically,
What now?
it's basically what's happened going forward. Obviously these guys are very knowledgeable, and I think that I'm hopeful that there'll be by that time, some new thoughts. Obviously, this morning we heard that there were a number of new people added to the staff, the cabinet, and others going forward. We'll talk about that. But I thought we'd begin. What I wanted to do today was to spend a little time talking about the results. We know what the results were. There are thousands of ways to slice and dice this material, but there were a number of key points that I thought were worthwhile making. We'll get your input. Then to move on to the transition, to evaluate what's happening, see what we think might continue to develop, any changes from what we've heard, and then I think take a short look into what we can expect going forward. And by that I mean looking beyond the transition to the inauguration and beyond. We're now selling jewelry on federal websites. There are other interesting things that are going on. And then to kind of try and summarize all of this, I'm not sure how to do this, except maybe just to lie down on the floor and pray. So.
Are they allowed to do that, selling jewelry?
No, they're not. But that's, that's the old story. We'd rather do it and apologize than ask and get told no. So I think we're going to see a lot of that, and it's just going to be part of the game. So let's start with the results. This chart, I think, is as good as any. There have been many of these. This is actually on the Cook political report, which we talked about on many occasions. And I think this is pretty up to date of the current state of the results. They're still counting in California for all the difference it makes. But they are counting. I believe Michigan is concluded. And, but in any event, there are some very interesting overall comments, I think, that I would make before we kind of open this up. First, we know, of course, as we did the other night, on election night, that it appeared, now we know for certain, that Clinton won the popular vote. At the moment, the differential here is 1.5 million votes. And it's likely, well, likely, it could certainly approach 2 million. It may or may not get there, but that's not an insubstantial margin. And then what they've done here, which I think is very interesting, is they've broken out the swing states, which we, of course, talked about in great detail, and the non-swing states. And then they've compared the margins of the Democrats in 12 and 16. So let me see what I can, well, that's not quite what I wanted. So, I'm getting very good at this as we finish and wind up the book. So these are the results going back to 2000. These are gross results in the election. And you'll see here that this was of course Bush-Gore, where they, I think Gore had what, 400,000 more votes than Bush. This is the 2004 election, where John Kerry was the candidate. And then we have the 2008 election. Mr. Obama got 69.5 million votes in that election, to 59 for John McCain. And then in 2012, Obama got 65 million, almost 66. And Romney got about the same number here. And now in 2016, we have Mr. Trump getting roughly that number of votes, and Hillary getting roughly that number of votes. In addition, there was almost 7 million other votes cast for various and sundry candidates, most of those received by either Mr. Johnson or Jill Stein, but there were a bunch of others who also got votes. McMullen, who ran in Utah, and assorted others. But clearly, in every state that, certainly in the close states where Clinton lost, the number of other votes was more than sufficient to have given her a victory in those states. Now, we can argue and discuss forever, as they still are doing about Ralph Nader in the 2000 election, as to what effect his position, now their position, had on the outcome. The truth is, we'll never know. And you can argue both sides. But I think that this is interesting, and I think I would say something else. The three states that really swung the tide were Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. If you take those three states, Trump won those three states by 106,000 votes combined out of 14 million cast. That's 0.007%, less than 1% of the vote.
Do you know how many electoral college seats those three?
Yeah, I think it's, let me see,
Sorry, I don't want to.
36, roughly, it's about 36, a little more.
Okay.
And, but what could have happened, is that if the blue wall had held up in Pennsylvania, let me push this up a little. If the blue wall had held up in Pennsylvania, which is, I think that was 20 votes, and let's go to Wisconsin. So here's Pennsylvania. So look at this. This is 2,009,1 to 2,084,000. It's about 60,000 votes. Wisconsin, 1,004,000 to 1,382,000. That's 18,000 votes. And if you go up to Michigan, this is 7,000 votes out of 5 million cast. So what could have happened is that if she had won Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, this election still wouldn't be decided because they'd be recounted in Michigan. Now, I have no idea how that would have come out, but it's interesting to speculate on how so few votes were responsible for all of this. So my take on this, and then I'll let you obviously join me. My take on this is this election was not won. This election was lost. And it was lost by the Democratic Party, it was lost by the Clinton campaign, and it was lost due to, there are many things, but I would suggest to you that in no particular order. They include, one, the Bernie crybabies who stayed home or who voted for third-party candidates. Say. Two, the African-American vote in certain places which did not come out the same way that they came out for Mr. Obama. Three, the Hispanic vote in some places which did not come out. Nevada was an exception, but certainly in Florida, where that vote is very split. You'll recall we talked about a Hispanic vote, but it includes Cubans, Puerto Ricans, people from the Caribbean and South and Central America. Those are totally different communities, but we don't keep good voting records of the differentials there. So I think those things, and then the white women who, without a college education, voted almost 2 to 1 for Trump. And with a college education, her margin was only 5-6 points. So, in truth, you know, I don't mean to be simplistic because, as I say, you can cut these numbers a million ways. But it seems to me that those were key things that affected. Comments, thoughts, yes?
There's been some talk about if Bernie had been the candidate, could he have defeated Trump?
It has.
Your thoughts?
And, you know, I think there's been talk about that. There's also been talk about what would have happened if Joe Biden had Joe. Well, you know, we're never going to know that. She clearly had a tremendous amount of baggage, which we talked about the whole time. This whole change issue really was based on not so much her campaign, but it was based on the concept that the big picture here was people wanted change in Washington. And there was very little that could be done to slow that momentum. And in some ways, I think she did a better job, it's possible to argue, than might have been expected, given all that. But of course, we had two of the least popular candidates in history. One of the interesting things is that exit polls on the day of the election, after the election, as people came out without knowing who they voted for, people were asked if they thought that both Hillary and Trump were qualified, and 2/3 of the people said that Trump was unqualified to be president. Now, I mean, that doesn't match up with, 60 million votes, so there's a disconnect there somewhere. Yes?
One of the problems I'm having with the change issue is that Washington is dysfunctional. Congress is not working. But the people that they sent to Washington, again, are the very people who were obstructionists, who have made it not work. So are we going to have change?
Well, it's something we can talk about going forward. I think that's a fair question. Sandy?
I heard on the news that was Milwaukee, where I lived for 29 years, the drop in the actual vote was enough, and
The differential.
The differential was enough to give Wisconsin to Trump. There was such a big drop in Milwaukee.
In Milwaukee.
Well, but also, some people voted down, usually the top of the ballot, then the votes go down. But there were a phenomenal number of people who voted just skipped the top and then went down, and it states.
Well, interestingly enough, I think I saw a statistic that said that in the states where there were Senate contestants, I think in every state, the presidential candidate who won, the senatorial candidate from that party won the election. And, I'm sorry? No, New Hampshire, she won it.
Yeah, we won.
She won it. So, I mean, that was close, but she won here. I think there was a hand up here that I saw. Yeah.
What do you think of the ramifications where the Republicans have been rewarded for their bad behavior? They were saying that the government's dysfunctional because that was their policy from the day Obama took over, to make Obama ineffective. All these fabricated charges against Hillary, or blown up charges, similar to Bill Clinton, where they were looking for one thing and then found something else and then blew that up. So it's the Republicans' policy to do this, and they've been rewarded now by the American people. What happens for the future?
We'll try to get to that. Sam?
Just going back to when Bernie won, Bernie's, pretty radical himself, and I just wonder if his, leftist views too far to the left would have scared off a lot of people, and maybe he wouldn't have won.
Yeah.
Well, I just find it ironic that if Bernie was the candidate, they would have gone after the fact that he honeymooned in Russia. Whereas, no, they would have called him a communist, they would have said he honeymooned in Russia, yet Trump admires Putin.
Well, there's no rhyme or reason for this. I think these are some interesting numbers that you may not have seen before. This is a summary. Legacy is not the right word here, but I put it in quotes. When Obama took office in 2008, and now going into 2017, this is what has happened to the Democrats and the seats they hold. In the Senate, they have 11 fewer seats. In the House, they have 60 fewer seats. They've lost 14 gubernatorial seats in the states, and they've lost 900 seats in state legislatures over that 8 years. Now, those are really, I haven't been able to find any comparable numbers, but I'm betting that no president has ever had these kinds of numbers, with the possible exception of Herbert Hoover somebody like, I haven't looked at those numbers, but this is telling. Now, what it means to the Democrats, what it means to the Republicans is a whole other thing. But I think that as much as many like to think that Mr. Obama brought to the presidency, one thing is for sure, whatever it was did not rub off on many, if any, other candidates. And the Republicans have outgunned, outmaneuvered on a state level virtually everywhere the Democratic Party as we now are trying to move forward.
And the irony is that the voters hold the Democratic administration responsible for the lack of progress or change in government, yet it's the Republicans who dominate the government.
I think that's very well put.
Okay,
Other
so
comments?
someone else?
Go ahead.
With redistricting, and we know in the other elections, states that Obama won handily, Wisconsin, they have many more Republican congressmen. I don't know how we're gonna get back unless that changes, because they have redistricted in such a way that
We can't get the House.
yeah, we can, and same thing in state legislatures. You wouldn't believe the state I know the best, Wisconsin, but it's all over. I don't know how you get it back.
Well, and in 2018, if we look forward, the senatorial map is particularly difficult for Democrats. So, without having any idea what's going to happen between now and then, these numbers could continue to wane.
Unless he does really bad.
Who will?
Yes.
Can we talk about those undeclared voters? Because supposedly we're supposed to have more Democrats, registered Democrats in this country than Republicans. I cannot understand the people who voted for Clinton twice, then turned around and voted for Bush twice, then turned around and voted for Obama twice, and now turned around and voted for Trump. Who are these people? Do they have any philosophy, at all about governing?
Change.
Anybody like to respond to that? There's an interesting question. I don't know what the political science department would say here at Dartmouth about that. I'm not sure I've heard that. I think that's a well-stated question. But I think it goes back to, among other things, goes back to change, this pendulum. It goes back to baggage. It goes back to, if you look at the income, voting, over 50,000, under 50,000. Trump got something like 60% of the votes of people who earn over $50,000. Now that has to tell us something, because presumably, not all, but many of those people are college educated. Clearly those people do, better than the people who earn less. There is some differentiation as you get over 200,000, but he still, was able to take a substantial portion of those votes. If you look at the market is responding favorably to whatever is now happening, and I certainly am not in the business of predicting the market, but this hasn't slotted, and some of the predictions, the initial response was very bad in the future market, but it all came back the very next day. So,
I think we really have to push those figures up, because there's lots of people making $50,000 a year that consider themselves not to be very wealthy at all, especially with the cost of higher education, medical, Medicare, not Medicare, but just various things that cost a lot of money. Even though inflation has been non-existent this whole time too, to boot. And a part of it just says that the Democrats lost their appeal to the middle and lower classes. and they became a kind of an elite party that was interested, frankly, in Wall Street, in the elites getting ahead. It stopped paying attention to the people who are not elites and talking to them. And we need, the Democrats need to talk to their base that they used to have 50, 60 years ago. All I have to say.
This morning, if I might, on MSNBC, they pointed out, and there was a piece in the, I think Valley News yesterday or today, about how the leadership of the Democratic Party nationally is old, very old. Now, the Republicans have decided, they changed the rules. I think the Democrats better wake up.
So this is a map of a densely populated or more densely populated counties. Now, this is the 2016 results. I mean, whoa! You know, I mean, this is very telling, I think. And I think that what perhaps is even more interesting is the next. Now,
Wow, that's a great picture.
Look how South Florida is blue.
so look at that. Here we go back to 92, Clinton. 96, this was 2000. The Bush-Gore contest. These were the two Obama contests. Now note,
No, not
That's four.
oh, I'm sorry, thank you, I beg your pardon. But note here in 2008 with Obama, there's a lot of red here, a lot of red, but Obama got, 69 million votes.
What is the white?
The white is,
A lot of light up there.
well, they're counties that don't, those are less populated areas, counties that don't. But, so, and here we are, in 2012. I think the point is obvious. The red is spreading, the red tide or whatever, and the blue is, shrinking. Yes.
Wasn't 2000 the first year that we started talking about the red states and the blue states?
It actually, I think, started before that. We actually talked about this. It was actually in the early 70s when one of the networks came up with, but originally, the colors were reversed.
Right.
The blue states were Republicans and the red states were Democrats. It was in the 90s at some point that I think these colors came to be, and this method of presentation was used. And there are some people who believe that this map is not, and we have used other presentations to try and reflect the population of the state, so that, for example, California would look even larger proportionately, whereas these states, which are large in area but have smaller population, would be smaller. But I think that's a less important point for this purpose. Now, somebody mentioned, South Florida has been Democratic, but this is the point here. The divide between red and blue America grew even deeper in 2016. Yes.
But the Democrats also have been pushing, and the media also picking this up, that we're going to get the Hispanic vote, we're going to get the black vote, we're going to get the Muslim vote. So they've been emphasizing when you get the minority vote, and maybe this has some effect on some of the other.
Well, what happened was that the white vote for the Democrats was significantly reduced. And still, the largest percentage of of the ethnic vote is white without a college degree. And Trump slaughtered Hillary in that department. And that was enough in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania to swing this.
I think it was it Chris Schmidt who's the who's the?
Steve Schmidt,
Steve Schmidt, is he the one who works for?
the Republican pollster.
Yeah, he
Oh.
said that they spent $2 million studying the data, and it was only 2 weeks out that they realized where their advantage was.
Mhm.
And they went to Michigan. And if you remember, the media was saying, Michigan, why is he going to Michigan? He really thinks he's gonna turn a blue state red, but they knew where their advantage was, and he said it was the, the most, successful or efficient or whatever in terms of use of data campaign.
Right.
And the media and the public, I think, had been almost laughing at the Trump campaign and how badly run it was.
So,
Even Illinois has an awful lot of red, didn't they? Go for.
yeah, no, Illinois was, but what happened here, Michigan is a state, first of all, you've got Detroit, where, which is historically a working class. Then you've got Ann Arbor, where the University of Michigan is, and Lansing to a lesser extent out there. But then you've got the rest of the state. And what they were able to do, as we said, 100,000 votes in 3 states out of 14 million cast. So that 2 or 20 or whatever it is $1 million was clearly very well spent and worth it. Yeah.
Okay, so in the last election, the Republican Party said, we have to work on getting more minorities into our party, or we are not going to survive.
Right.
And they did not do it, and they just decided to go after the white vote. Okay? Where does that leave the Democrats now? What's our postmortem? Where do we go now? What should we concentrate on?
So I think that's the $64,000, that is a $64,000 question. The Democratic Party now, it appears that the Clintons are out of the picture. They have yet to pick a chairman for the Democratic National Committee. They have Mr. Schumer, who's going to be the minority leader in the Senate. They've postponed a vote on the minority leader in the House. I think there are some people who feel, some Democratic reps who feel that Nancy Pelosi is old guard and should be moved aside. And she claims that she's got 2/3 of the votes without even making a phone call. That may well be true. But I think it's a fair question. What will the Democratic Party do at this point? How are they going to do it? The election for 2020 has already, I hate to say this, but it's already begun in certain places. And so they've certainly got a lot of work to do. I think to the point that the post-mortem that the Republicans did in 2012 and came up with this idea, which I think everybody thought was a great idea, but when they wound up with a candidate who didn't appeal to those minorities, they were really, quote unquote, behind the 8 ball. So the strategy they had to use was to get out the white vote. And in fact, that's what they were able to do, despite all of these slurs and yes, and experts, etc. They were able to drive the white vote, and I think there were many different reasons. As I said, the millennials were one business, the white women were another business. Hillary won the minority groups, but she didn't win them by the same percentages that Obama won. So if Obama got 92 or 3% of the black vote, she got 84 or 85%. Well, that 8 or 9 percentage points is a huge difference. I think that this is all part of the story. I'd like to move on, unless you've got some final comments here, Sam?
I think it's good to remember this was really a close election. White people in 3 states, by that very small number that I've already forgotten, but I remember it pretty small.
100,000.
So I don't think that the Democrats have got to do a whole lot. They got to do some things for sure, but I mean, they shouldn't just sort of throw their hands up and say, oh my God, what the hell do we do now? Use my language. I think, as I've said before, if they go back to their roots, Roosevelt, which affects all people who are not making hundreds of millions of dollars, whatever their color is. And if the Democrats get their act together and start proposing, maybe not being able to pass because the Republicans are in charge, but at least talking about, here's what we would do if we were in charge, and just pound it away for the next 4 years.
2 years.
2.
2, right, 2 for sure, and certainly the next 4.
Brian?
I mean, I think to get a little bit away from, to go back to one of your first points was the percentage of the exit poll. To
Yeah.
me, points out what part of, how do I want to put it? I just think that people are tired by the time comes around, to be honest with these polls. And yet we continue to put all this stock into
Yeah.
what is being said. And I just think that he's going to continue doing his Twitter. He had a big dinner the other night, and
At 21.
and the media was told to go to Trump Towers, and he showed up elsewhere for his dinner. I just think that's going to make a huge. I mean, the media, despite what we say or think, plays a huge role in everything, and I just think it's going to be a huge change under this administration.
You had a comment?
I forgot. Go ahead.
I have something on polling. I think one of the things that happened, I know from running, you visit hardcore voters and you visit voters who only vote in presidential. But I think what happened with the polling, one of the things that they weren't even talking to people who, I mean, they know who votes. And I think part of it might be they weren't talking to people who might not have normally voted.
Well, I think that's true. I think that some of, certainly in Wisconsin and Michigan, it seemed clear that there were people who lived out in the boonies, when they used that phrase, who were not traditional voters, and those people didn't get phone calls, and they weren't part of the mix.
I remember what I thought, the Democrats need to work on 2018, not even thinking about 2020, because don't we do another census in 2020?
We do.
And I think that Republicans got in because of the census and the gerrymandering that went on. And if we can get a majority back in the Senate or the House or whatever, we can start districting appropriately.
Well, we can
Is that
begin to
true?
begin to
I
address
mean, I don't know,
that
is
point.
that
The
correct?
districting's done by states.
I know, but so we have to get the Democrats back in, so we can district.
Okay, let's wrap this up.
We've been talking about the Democrats, we've got the Republicans learning something, where they had a candidate who was close to the center, not so far right. Of course, Trump was everywhere, so we're not quite sure what he stood for. But he was a bit saying some more centrist type of things. The Republicans won the governorships in New Hampshire and Vermont. So is there a message to Republicans, if they rein in their far right, at least verbally, and move a bit more to the center, they can be much more successful?
So I think that takes us into the kind of transition piece. How many of you saw the 60 Minutes interview with Trump? So what was your reaction to that? That's a good reaction.
He doesn't know anything. He doesn't know enough to be president.
I heard he was very controlled. I couldn't watch it. I heard he was very controlled.
I mean, did he say anything?
No, we didn't say anything ridiculous either.
Yeah, he was very controlled. He said, I think one line that I recall is, which he repeated several times, "I won easily." And Leslie never came back. She actually didn't come back on anything, except,
The abortion thing she did.
yes, except on the abortion. And then he said, well, they're going to have to go elsewhere to get their abortions. But this was the first of what you know, we're gonna see over presumably an extended period of time. And I think it is true, he didn't say anything that was outrageous. He seemed calm. The family was there. And I thought, you know, it was kind of a non-event in that regard. So now, a few days later, a week, maybe a little more, we're beginning to see the outlines of some appointments. We see the two appointments in the White House, Priebus, I can never remember his name, Priebus, and Bannon, who seem to me to represent two fairly opposite sides of the spectrum, although let's not suggest that Mr. Priebus is a liberal or even a centrist Republican. He's not. He's very conservative. And he comes out of the mold of Walker and Ryan and those guys. And then, in the last few days, we've heard about General Flynn. Sorry. Flynn. Frank Flynn. No, Mike Flynn. So, Flynn was basically kicked out of, you know, his last job because the people with whom, the Joint Chiefs and others with whom he was consorting, felt that he was really, you know, over the hill. Not old over the hill, but that his conduct and his positions had become more and more extreme. Then we have Mr. Sessions, the senator from Alabama, who has a fairly long history of anti-black comments and positions which he's taken over the years, and which actually prevented him from being appointed as a federal judge back 20 years ago. The Senate actually voted him down. He's now going to be the chief law enforcement officer for the United States. And we have this fellow from Kansas, who I actually know very little about, who is going to be the head of the CIA, and his record in Congress has been essentially the lead guy on the Benghazi hearings. So we can expect, I think, to see perhaps more of this. Then we have a whole lot of speculation. We have Mr. Romney coming in this weekend. We have Sarah Palin's name being floated as Secretary of Interior. I think she's getting her house together. There are a whole series of other people, including Mr. Giuliani. The only one of these guys who seems to have dropped, two guys, have dropped out of the picture. Chris Christie is toast. He's definitely gone. And everybody associated with him is gone. And the other guy who seems to have dropped out of the picture is Newt Gingrich. So, but everybody else is still in play. And your guess at this point is as good as mine. So, what's your take on all of this? In what direction are we moving? Yes?
I think what we're doing is, one of the things, okay, on our first day of class, you showed a graph of where we get our information. And all of us in this class were up here, whereas the
Right, by
ones
age,
down there.
right.
So I've made it a point since then to ask law students or undergrad students, where do you get your information?
Uh-huh.
Facebook, Vox, I think something like Vox.
Yeah?
No, they don't. All this is to say that I think a lot of people felt sort of in love with this image of Trump that came from The Apprentice, this all-powerful, wealthy man, and they didn't realize, seriously, I don't think they really realized that he was only playing a character. And I think they took a lot of comfort in thinking this guy's going to take over. I've heard so many kids say, well, he's a billionaire and he can run a business, so he can run the country. It's all media driven. Social media, yes.
So are we going to wake up every morning to tweets?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, I think the answer to that is
Yes.
probably.
Yeah, well, he's already talked about that. He just said that it was a wonderful way to get information out, and he was not in the
140 characters, is that right in a tweet?
Yeah.
That's a lot of important information. I guess what you do is you add, times 10 is 1,400, so.
Well, the other thing is that's going on now too is the misinformation on Facebook.
The misinformation.
Misinformation
Yes.
that was presented as mainstream.
Fake news.
Yes, fake news.
Fake news.
And,
We're seeing a lot more of that, we're seeing articles about that.
Right.
A lot more than I can ever recall having seen it. There are apparently people who specialize in this business.
yes.
And
Macedonia.
so, further.
What's going to happen in the fabric of our democracy where you have very close election, winning by a few votes, lost the popular vote by a lot, and yet he's going with his own agenda with no accommodation to the people, to the majority who he lost to. What ramifications that can have for our democracy?
So what about the family?
Oh, please.
I mean, they're everywhere. He had a meeting with the Prime Minister of Japan, and Ivanka and the son-in-law, Jared, apparently participated in that. Wasn't clear to me who else was in the meeting, but there's been a lot of comment about that. Is that an indication of what we're likely to see? Are we going to see family members, involved in these? I mean, is Ivanka going to sit on the National Security Council? I mean, anything is possible. Yes.
Can legal action be taken in terms of nepotism?
Well, there is a nepotism law. It was passed after the Kennedy, Bobby's appointment as Attorney General. In fact, it's like many laws, it's a little unclear. It's not clear what positions it might affect. It may depend on whether or not the positions are paid, because if the positions are unpaid, there probably is nothing that they could do. I would also suggest something else. I would suggest that in the case of Trump, because he's the person we're talking about, with this big family circle, if they're sitting around the living room in Trump Tower, there is nothing to prevent him from saying anything he wants to. Nothing. And I would suggest to you that that is a most unfortunate potential situation, yes.
My question is about the profiteering of his job in the government, in that his children will be running his business. I don't understand this blind trust thing. That
Well, you don't have to worry about it because first of all, I don't think it's going to happen. And second of all, if it does, it won't mean anything. Because they're not going to take any major steps in the business without getting his approval, regardless of what the blind trust
So
says.
he's going to be profiting off his presidential position, his business. Now, it's a done deal with them.
Yeah, and he potentially already is, because he's getting briefings already.
So
which
he's getting a
sharing
heads up
with
on
his
things in
family.
the business world before anyone else. Didn't Martha Stewart go to jail for that?
Well, she
No,
went to
I'm
jail for
serious.
something else.
No,
But I would make, at the risk of overstating, which I don't think it is much, I would suggest to you the one thing you can be sure of is that when Donald Trump leaves office, he will have 3 to 4 to 5 times as much wealth as he has today.
Exactly.
Absolutely, there isn't any question about it. And there's nothing,
And he won't pay taxes.
and he won't pay taxes on it, and he will, it's clear to me that he'll be able to, quote unquote, get away. Nobody's gonna go after him.
Won't show his tax return.
So, no, we're never gonna see
But
that.
he's not gonna collect an income, he said to,
Oh, right, he's not gonna collect
He's
anything.
not gonna take.
Well, Mr. Obama didn't take it either, as I
Oh, is that right?
And I believe there are, I don't think George W. Bush took it. So there's some historical precedent for that. Sam.
What about impeaching him? I've read at least one article that said guarantees he'll be impeached by the end of the second year.
Well, the problem with impeaching is you've got to have people in the Congress who want to do this. And with the Republicans in Congress, there are some clearly who are not supporters. But impeachment, you know, they need 2/3 of the House to impeach. And I don't see that as a
So
realistic.
if it got really ridiculous what he was doing, I mean, he was doing really, really bad things, wouldn't it be enough sane, quote unquote, Republicans and Democrats that could get the 2/3? I mean, it had to be really ridiculous in order to.
Well,
And then what do we get, Pence?
well, and then, I mean, assuming, well, first of all, there are 2 steps here. The House has to bring an order of impeachment, then the Senate has to hear it. And no, it's not 2/3. It's I think it's a majority. But you know, I think planning on that is not a good idea. It's not going to happen. I think it'll be very.
I was curious about it, because this is one person thought it was a done deal, but who knows what he knows.
I heard something that I never thought about. He knew something. He was clairvoyant. He built a hotel right near the White House. And when, I don't know if you saw this, and they were saying, so President Wishy-Wash comes in to visit him, and, oh, I just love your hotel. I mean, they're not gonna say, I stayed at the Hyatt. So he's gonna make a lot of money just by virtue of the location.
So he has a 60-year lease on that property for $3 million a year, and he's currently fighting the tax assessment, which he's been doing since it was originally released, since it was originally assessed. The building is run, technically owned, by the General Services Administration. One of the positions that he gets to fill is the head of the GSA.
Oh, how is it, are you talking about his hotel?
Yeah,
Why is it run by the GSA?
they own the
It's
property.
rent the old post office.
It's the post office. They rent it. The Trumps rent it. So, he's gonna be his own landlord. And you can trust me on this, the tax assessment will be reduced. Yes.
Well, there are also other hotels that had bid for the old post office.
Yes, they did.
And they couldn't meet his rent. They said they didn't think they could make that much money to pay that. So the idea is that he's going to renegotiate the contract now because he can't bring in the amount of money to pay that.
Anything is possible. Anything is possible,
What
yes.
about all these outstanding lawsuits, including the one that's supposed to go to trial?
So, this is very interesting. I heard this morning, maybe I dreamt it, that there was news in San Diego that they were moving toward a settlement of the Trump University lawsuit. Well, I don't know. I think it would be the smartest thing he could do. That's the most dangerous of all the lawsuits that are out there for lots of reasons. I'm sure that if there is a settlement, one, he certainly will admit no guilt. We know that. And two, what I think is even more interesting, I wonder whether the amounts involved will ever be revealed, or whether that will be kept under, whether basically everybody will be subject to a non-disclosure agreement. I'm sure that that's what the Trump lawyers have in mind.
Have we ever had a situation that's so chaotic and that is so dangerous for our democracy? I really am scared.
Well, we've never had a president-elect who has had these potential conflicts of interest because of his business activities. And so I think the rest kind of speaks for itself. And I think it raises some issues that have never been raised before. And I think if history is any guide, during this campaign we've seen that the answer is what I say today. I promise you I will never lie to you. That's the biggest lie of all, actually, or at least potentially. And then he goes on to say something that you know darn well isn't the case. And I don't think, you know, they keep saying, is Trump going to pivot? Why should he pivot? He won. So why should he pivot? And the idea that he could have been a Democrat and that he, you know, he had these positions 10, 15, 20 years ago on certain topics, abortion, gay marriage, are totally irrelevant. Because from one day to the next, I think it's been demonstrated that his position changes. And there's no reason to believe, I think, that that's going to, that I think it's going to change. Well, let's take a short break. I want to finish off this discussion on the transition. I want to talk a little bit with you about what we can expect, and then try and summarize this in 2 sentences before I send you out into the sun, which is shining brightly. So let's take a 7 or 8 minute break and come back.
What do you think the Obamas are going to do?
I think they're going to stay in D.C. until the,
Yeah, but
and then I think they're going to Chicago.
Say Trump will
Think
come.
so?
Yeah, I think they bought a big house there.
what a big house to watch.
I think they bought a big house in Chicago. I think.
What are the Clintons?
So,
Less expensive.
there are a couple of interesting things that are, if not confusing, that are more than interesting. Trump has proposed 2 initiatives that are conceivably surprising. What are they?
Infrastructure.
Well, no, I don't think that's surprising. The first one is term limits for Congress. Wow, there's an interesting idea,
I know.
which Mitch McConnell said we already have term limits. They're called elections. What a great line from a nasty. And the other one
Lobbying.
is lobbyists, putting a 5-year term on lobbyists before you could register as a lobbyist after you left the administration or after you left Congress. I think that's a very interesting proposal.
Why is he, why is he coming up with these items? Why is it in his interest or?
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I think,
Draining the swamp.
yeah, he's draining the swamp. And of course, the reaction to both of these, to virtually, certainly all the Republicans, and maybe many of the Democrats, is, whoa, where did that come from? So, how strongly is he likely to push these initiatives? Again, I don't know. I'm not sure where they came from. I'm not sure there's any, you know, the term limits thing is really an issue because presumably that would require a constitutional amendment. So the likelihood of that is probably very, remote, but it's still nonetheless kind of interesting that he would toss these into the hopper. And I have no idea whether they will ever resurface in any meaningful way, but they might. So, what do you think if you were advising Mr. Trump in terms of where to start once he's got his team in place? What are the early initiatives that you think he could take that could make a positive impact on the country and presumably on his ability to govern? What are the things that you would, yes?
Well, I'd like him to try and tamp down this racial stuff. He's got to lower the temperature in the country.
Okay.
And he's risen the temperature by his choices of these proven racially biased people. And I don't know how he's going to do that. I don't know if you ever listened to Smerconish. Yes, Smerconish, excuse me. And he's really a Republican, and he said Trump's got to go into the schools and tell these kids this is not acceptable behavior. And I don't know how he's going to do that and say it's not acceptable. Was I just kidding? And so I think if he starts lowering the temperature, then he can start getting his initiatives out there.
Okay. Further, I have a yes,
I
ma'am.
think he'll have no trouble getting an infrastructure package through.
Okay, infrastructure. Now that's interesting. I think I saw that Janet Yellen testified before Congress yesterday, I think, recently, and basically said we need to be careful about a $1 trillion package, that this could have significant impacts on our overall debt, et cetera, et cetera. But an infrastructure bill, I think, is something that we certainly can expect to see. What we won't hear is that, Obama had an infrastructure bill, that never got off the ground. They did pass, remember what was the original one, the ARRA, the Something Recovery Act, the American Something and Recovery Act way back in 2009. And then there was another one, I think, in 2014, where they did get some money. But basically, they were cut off at the pass by the Republicans in that area. So I think we certainly can expect to see something in infrastructure. And in fact, leaving aside the issue of how many dollars, that certainly could put some people to work. So that's a positive thing. What else?
Did I read someplace this morning about Apple was thinking of having the iPhone manufacturing come back from Mexico into the US?
I didn't see that, but it's interesting. There was a bit this morning that he announced, I think on Twitter, that he was responsible for Ford not moving an automobile manufacturing facility down to Mexico. The problem with that is that Ford never had any intention of moving the facility down to Mexico. So this is a continuation of just, an absolute outright lie that, you then move on and let everybody else basically have to clean it up. And then, of course, when if you confront him, he says, I never said that.
Yeah.
So, this is a continuing rolling of this kind of thing. But what about, for example, he did spend a fair amount of time during the campaign talking about Carrier Corporation. They have an air conditioning plant somewhere in the upper Midwest. I think it may be outside of Cleveland, maybe in Youngstown, I'm not, somewhere up there. And they are intending to move this plant. They've announced it. They've told the workers, I think it's, 1,200, 1,500 jobs, and they intend to move it to Mexico. Now, Carrier is a division of a very big company called United Technologies, which, among other things, is very big in the defense aerospace business. So I would suggest to you that it's not out of possibility that if Trump or someone from the administration sat down with the people of United Technologies and said, hey guys, maybe you should rethink this, that it's not totally inconceivable that that might happen. And I would suggest to you, as opposed to this last little bit this morning about Ford, which was totally untrue, that this could be a real kind of front-end picture for the administration for being able to take on, you know, the big companies. Remember when JFK, you know, brought the steel companies in? That was about raising prices. And he got lots of kudos because the steel companies basically took back the price increases that they had announced. So that's not totally inconceivable. Yeah.
Are you implying, though, that United Technologies then might expect some favors in terms of contracts?
No. Oh, I wouldn't suggest that. What I am implying, though, what I am implying was that he's in a position to say your position in this industry and the likelihood of your getting contracts going forward may be significantly reduced. That's what I was suggesting. I certainly would never say that I wouldn't want to go on record. Having been in that industry business for a number of years as a consultant, I would never say.
This may be off the subject, but Trump mentioned very much about getting rid of Obamacare.
Yes.
The whole health care system.
Yes.
Which has had us all up in the air for years. How in the world is he, what is he talking about?
So,
Healthcare is huge.
so let's take just a minute. I heard, this goes back now a little more than a week ago, and I heard a comment which I found very offensive. Not from Trump, but there was a comment about, you know, it's repeal and replace Obamacare. And the response to that has been, from many Democrats and others, if you repeal it, before you replace it, you're going to have maybe 10 million or more people who will not have health care. And Joe Scarborough on Morning Joe said, I happen to be listening, well, if 10 million people don't have health insurance, that's too bad. In 4 years, they'll have a chance to vote Trump up. To me, that was an unbelievable, tasteless comment. Because by then, you've got people who have died, who have had all kinds of other problems because of this. So now there's been some kind of discussion about replace before you repeal. Reverse those and come up with some a plan, because the Republicans have no plan that anybody's ever seen. There's never been a plan to replace Obamacare.
Well, I'm just wondering if that's why Mitt Romney's meeting with him, because wasn't this Mitt Romney hatched plan in Massachusetts
It was.
originally?
It was
So
actually.
I'm just wondering if
That's an interesting comment. Interesting comment.
What about what we just talked about earlier? He also supposedly, at least Paul Krugman was all worried about it, that he wants to abolish Medicare.
Well, so right, so let's move on. Let's talk about the entitlements, Social Security and Medicare. So you may recall that George W. Bush had a plan to privatize Social Security, which, you know, never got through Congress, but it generated some support. And there has been long in the Democratic Party, in the Republican Party, supported by Paul Ryan, absolutely, to turn Medicare into a voucher program, so that people would get vouchers which they could use at hospitals who wouldn't accept them, and that the value, of course, of those vouchers would be continually reduced over a period of time. A wonderful system. And Medicare has no no financial issues at all at this point in time. I think the last numbers were, assuming it continued on this current basis, that it was all right until 2038 or some such date. It was well 2028.
Yeah, I'm reading the Washington Post fact check.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're
I'm glad you're here. Yes.
Well, weren't the vouchers supposed to be to purchase insurance from the insurance company?
Yes.
So
To purchase
you're not
policy.
necessarily using it directly with the
No,
hospital.
that's correct.
But he said also that the two elements that he wants to keep are the most expensive ones. The pre-existing conditions you must take care of, and children up to 25.
So, and the people who have looked at this have said, you can't keep those two things without, basically having the same tenants as you have. But I think, my take is the entitlements will be on the table. And I think that is something to be concerned about. And because I think that, the world as we have known it, the country as we have known it for the last 50 or more years, Social Security and Medicare have been pretty critical elements, and seriously, significantly changing those could have a real impact on millions of people. In addition to that, there's the safety net, food stamps, dozens of other programs, which are basically dedicated to people who would be classified as poor. And I think there's a significant chance that many of those items are going to be, if not eliminated, they're going to be severely reduced. And I think this Republican Congress, with the leadership that they now have, is poised to attempt to do this. Yes, Judy?
I think if that happened, that the protests that you're doing, the students who are against the president will have got nothing compared to what the protests would happen at that time for the general public.
Yep.
Yeah.
On the barricade.
Somebody else. Sam?
What about the earned income tax credit? That's been something that a lot of Republicans have talked about, and the Democrats as well. But this is a way to get cash into the hands of people who need it. And I've read several articles about it. When you really talk to people who are behind the eight ball, they actually are pretty good at managing their money. They know they got a very little, and the best they can, they survive. What they want is the money in the first place. So and the income tax credit has the beauty of you do have to be working to get it.
Yeah.
So that fits into the creed of the Republicans. And I don't see why we can't significantly increase the income tax credit.
Well, I think we're going to see, I'm not directly responding to that, but what I'm saying is I think what we're going to see is also some changes in the tax code.
Oh, that's the other.
And obviously, I think we are not clear what these are going to be, but the likelihood is these tax reductions will be directed, as his tax plan has already said, at the people at the very top who will pay less in tax. And the impact on the middle class, I think, will be, if it goes the way it's currently set out, will be basically minimal. And one of the key questions is, if you're going to reduce taxes, but you're going to increase defense spending, and you're going to increase the amount of support necessary for other programs, how are you going to be able to pay for this?
Well,
It
haven't
doesn't
we
make
done
sense.
this already? Didn't we do this from 2008?
We did.
Enter two wars and, lower taxes.
Well, there was a lot, yes, and that's one of the reasons the debt ran up so high.
He said for every program increased spending they add, they have to drop something.
Right.
Which if that's really happening, we can only imagine some of the things that he proposed to drop. Like the
Solar and stuff like that.
It's also, that's where Ryan is coming from. And he's no dummy, this guy from Wisconsin. He's no dummy. They're gonna go after entitlements, but I heard Eric Cantor, who is very, very conservative, and he said the other day, if the Republicans go after Medicare or Social Security, he basically, his blank will be grass. That the public will go crazy, because people don't want the government, but you ask them if they want to keep their Social Security and Medicare, and that could lead to massive.
So I found a quote that I think is to me, this was quite an amazing quote. Elections belong to the people. It's their decision. If they decide to turn their backs on the fire and burn their behinds, then they will just have to sit on their blisters. Anybody tell me who said that? Because you'll never guess. Abraham Lincoln.
Interesting.
Wow. I mean, that sounds least like Abraham Lincoln of virtually anything I could have imagined. He did. Amazing.
Can you email us that quote?
I can send it to you.
Thank you. I love it.
It's a great quote. So let's just move this on. One of the things that's part of it been discussed, the whole issue of legislation and how it'll be handled in Congress. So you all know that in the Senate they have this thing called a filibuster. And the filibuster was originally passed way back, and at one time it was actually it was used in the House as well as the Senate. But the House discarded it because they had too many people, and it just really didn't, it was even worse than its effect in the Senate. The term filibuster, as I understand it, comes from the Dutch word meaning pirate. I have no idea how pirates and filibusters come together, but that's apparently where it came from. And the first time that it was used in the Senate was against the Treaty of Versailles. Whoa. Is anybody around for that? Don't tell me. So, but that's a long time ago. And then it was rarely used until the days of civil rights legislation, when the Southern senators then used it. And in fact, the longest filibuster on record is just over 24 hours by
Jimmy Stewart.
no, yes, Jimmy Stewart, right. In that movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, isn't that the movie? And the senator from North Carolina, Strom Thurmond, 24 hours and some minutes was the longest, and that was against the Civil Rights Act. So the purpose of that, of course, is to cut off, is to prevent action from taking place. So then they developed this idea called cloture, or presumably closure, when you could cut off the filibuster. And originally, it required 2/3 of the vote of the Senate to cut it off. And then the Senate could go forward and act one way or another on the bill. In the 70s, I believe it was, that number was reduced from 2/3 to 60 votes. So the number now to get cloture is 60 votes. You'll recall the Senate breakdown now is 52-48. And there is one additional Senate seat yet to be decided. Louisiana. There's a runoff vote December 10th in Louisiana between a guy whose name is John Kennedy, who's a Republican, naturally, and a fellow I think whose last name is Campbell, who is the Democrat. Kennedy is favored and will probably win, but if by some good fortune Campbell is able to raise some money, and that's a question, he might be able to knock Kennedy off, in which case it would be 51 to 49, which would even be a little more interesting, if you will. So that's yet to be decided, and who knows. But my point here is that this cloture situation is very interesting. And McConnell, who is a traditionalist and would like very much, I think, not to make changes to the rules that might come back and bite him or the Republicans on their blisters, I think is probably loath to make changes. But if early in the game there is a lot of this going on in the Senate, then we may see what they call the threat of the nuclear option, which would be to eliminate the possibility of cloture. And so one other thing we haven't talked about yet in terms of the agenda is the Supreme Court. Won't that be something that we will see early on in the game? I think it will be. And I don't know who that person will be. It's unlikely to be his sister, who's a retired federal judge, but anything is possible. So he had that list of what, 12, 15 acceptable judges, and we may see one of those, or we may see somebody totally different. I don't think Ted Cruz is going to be on the Supreme Court. I don't think he wants to be at this point, but maybe I'm wrong. Yeah.
I want to talk about climate change a little bit. And,
Climate change.
and-
Whoa.
Well,
Good.
well, but I just heard yesterday, because he's calling it a hoax and everything, and today on the news, the North Pole is 36 degrees warmer than what it was. I mean, like, it's just getting worse and worse. But I read something interesting, because he says he's going to pull out of the Paris Accord. The previous French Prime Minister said what we're going to do if he pulls out of Paris is put a carbon tax. It was a suggestion to put a carbon tax on all exports out of the United States if they pull out of the Paris Accord. Of course, when he said that, I thought, great, he'll say, all right, you do that, I'll pull out a NATO. You know, that's what he would do.
This is like, you know, yeah, this is like a schoolyard,
Yeah.
you know, recess.
Well, you know, that's how he operates.
And so, further thoughts on this idea about, you know, if we were, what we think are likely to be early initiatives. Yeah.
I don't know about trade agreements and tariffs.
Well, I think trade agreements are absolutely in the mix. Trade agreements are absolutely in the mix, and I think we don't know what's going to happen. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, if I had to bet, I would say that's going to wind up on the floor. They're going to tear it up and throw it away, and then we're, you know, our relationships with those countries in Southeast Asia in particular are going to be more problematic than they have been. And with NAFTA, I think it's anybody's guess. Will he try and renegotiate certain parts of that? It's possible. I don't know. What about, here's one, what about executive orders? Whoa, executive orders. So I have a chart here for you on executive orders, which is actually, I think, kind of interesting. Let me see if I can quickly find it. Executive orders. So you know, one of the cries of the Republican administration, the Republicans over the last years is the number of executive orders that Obama has issued. The greatest number in history, I think, is by far. So here's a list of the numbers of executive orders issued by presidents over a period of time. And you'll notice that they actually start to be numbered back. They start to be numbered, if I can, over here. Each executive order actually has a number, which presumably makes it easier to keep track of. That would seem sensible. So here's the list of recent executive orders. And look where Obama's number is. It's behind Bush, it's behind Clinton, it's behind Reagan, it's behind Carter, it's behind Nixon, it's behind Johnson, it's behind Eisenhower. It's nowhere on that list. Now, I have to say that there are executive orders, then there are executive memorandum, or memoranda, and then there are executive actions. So it's not quite straightforward. But I would, and the difference is sometimes difficult to know. Let me say, the one thing about executive orders that we know is that they have the effect of law. They're published in the Federal Register so that everybody can see them. Executive actions are like a wish list. That's the best way I can describe it. At one point, a couple of years ago, Obama issued a series of 26, I think it was, executive actions on gun control. You may or may not remember this. And they ranged all over the place, from trying to move to get background checks to education programs. It was a whole range of things. Executive memorandum, this is where it gets tricky. These are kind of in between. They're not really, they're stronger than a wish list. They may not have the same effect as executive actions. They do not get published in the Federal Register. So, and Obama has issued a lot of executive memoranda. So my point here, I think, is this. Mr. Trump is, well, he was not the principal one. It was Ted Cruz, Lion Ted, who said, you know, the very first day, he was going to sit at the desk and tear up these executive orders. And I think we can see that one goal of the administration will be to remove as much as they can of the names and that Obama has on legislation or on these executive orders. So I think we can look to have that done.
What are some of the examples?
Well, I think that's a fair question. Let me
Clean air, emissions control.
yeah, I think that actually that was one. Let me see if they have any here. I can't find them. But he's used them in many situations where he was unable to get action from the Congress.
Just about everything he tried to do.
And so here they were on climate change. They were on the Iran deal. They were on financial regulations. They were on climate change. they were on anti-deportation protection for children of immigrants. All of those things were done by executive order and more. So I think that we can expect to see those torn up. I don't think there's any question about it.
Well, if
And-
they tear up,
I'm sorry?
if they tear up the one on protecting children of undocumented, will they then just go and haul their?
I think the answer is they could, and that's something we haven't talked about, namely the immigration business. Are they really going to deport, 2 to 3 million people, when I think the latest number I saw about people with criminal records was about 400,000. So Obama deported
A whole bunch.
2,400,000 over a period of
Right.
7 years. He's talking about doing it, as soon as possible. And I don't know, there are pictures of the old Japanese internment. Some very unpleasant.
Are they going to do a registry? They talked about a registry.
And I suspect at the moment they don't know. But I think with the people who they are appointing to these positions, I think that those possible alternatives are more likely than not. That's my take. So, further thoughts on, yeah,
What will you do about, if anything, about the criminal justice system? Prison reform, gun control?
gun control is off the table.
It's off the table.
I think, I haven't heard a lot about prison reform. My guess is, if anything, you may see more of a move to privatize it. Giving the prisons over to private industry, which has happened in some cases, but there have been some terrific problems. And so I think the likelihood of what Obama might have considered prison reform to be, or criminal justice reform to be pretty modest.
Yeah, so wants to bring back and extend stop and frisk to other cities.
Well, right, that's an old Rudy bit, which he did in New York, and I think we'll see, certainly, I mean, there's nothing to believe that Sessions, who is likely to be the Attorney General, is going to be anything but very conservative, excuse me, in how he treats these particular issues.
Well, the American Civil Liberties Union already said, we're here, we're coming out if you do these things.
Well, I think, coming out is good.
Court.
Right. And we're likely to see lawsuits. We're likely to see, I think, possibly more demonstrations in the streets. But query what effect, what impact will these have? So I'd like to try and wind up on a positive note.
What did you smoke?
Is pot legal here?
Several people have suggested to me, or have asked me, what can we do at this point? It's depressing. And I think I'd like to suggest a couple of things. One, I think we all need to take a pretty deep breath. This was for many of us, a shocking conclusion to a process that was weird and bizarre, but that we never thought would wind up the way it did. And I don't think the president-elect thought it would end up the way it did. But here we are. So, to me, one of the things I think that's most important is that those of us who feel that there is real work to be done. We saw those numbers earlier about the changes in Congress and in the State House and in the state legislature. I think it speaks volumes. The map that we saw, where the red was bleeding into many, many new areas, speaks volumes. And I think this means that those who are interested need to remain involved. I think they need to find ways to become more active if they're so inclined, at least to be available to write letters to their Congress people. We do have here in New Hampshire 4, as it happens, Democratic representatives, 2 senators, and now 2 congressmen, women, all 4 women. And hopefully they will be responsive. I think that if the entitlements and the safety net and other things begins to come under attack, I think we're all going to have to find ways to make our views known. And there are many organizations to which many of you may belong, and others, and other ways to do that. But I think that we can't afford, in any way, shape, or form, to turn our backs and basically walk away from the process. I think that would be a huge mistake. And I would hope that that would not be an option. One of my favorite quotes from Ted Kennedy is, "Sometimes a party must sail against the wind. We cannot afford to drift or lie at anchor. We cannot heed the call of those who say it is time to furl the sail." And I think that it's my belief that this election, we've said this before, this election was not the end of anything. It was the end of a long, tiring campaign. But this really is a renewed beginning of a fight and an effort to regain the soul of American democracy. And I think that we all need to participate in this and to do the best we can to see that it develops positively. It's not going to happen overnight. We're going to need to take many steps. We're going to have to spend, not necessarily our individual money, but we're going to have to spend money and raise money to do this, because the Democratic Party is behind the 8 ball. And we've been out-organized and outmaneuvered. Mr. Trump is a total anathema. I think, these concepts about term limits and 5-year limitation on, those are terrific objectives. But where they came from and how serious he is about them, I think, is extremely difficult at this point to evaluate. And I think our concern should be to follow closely what's happening and to continue to strive to take back what we have lost over a period of time. Mr. Obama in many ways was an incredible president. Certainly his approval rating today is probably as great, if not greater, than virtually any other president at this time in their term, second term. But unfortunately, he fell short in certain very important aspects. And so we're faced with a requirement for new leadership. We're faced with a requirement for new support. We're faced with a requirement to try and find ways to appeal to white voters, believe it or not. Many without college educations, but many with. And that job really is a job for all of us.
My son sent me, or might have posted it on Facebook, and it's gone around, a list, which I'm going to send to you, Maynard, and it's saying exactly what you just said. Now, they offer, things that we can do, organizations that we could participate in, that make a difference in people's lives. They also put their website for giving money, but forget that part now, but just working or helping. I will send it to you. It's very thorough.
Is it Nicholas Kristof?
Kristoff's 12-step program.
12.
Yeah, that was it. Was that today's paper or yesterday's?
I'll look, I
Yeah.
thought, this had more than 12, I think, but anyway, I'll send
But
it.
there are so many things, and I think, as I say, the important thing is, this is not the time to give up the ship. I think that's what's, there's so much that can be done. This country is too important and has been so wonderful to all of us. We all have, most of us have grandchildren, and I think I have much more of a concern about them than I do about myself. I'm well over the hill, and they haven't even seen the hill. So I think whatever we can do, and whatever we can do to talk and work with them, I think is crucial, because they will be the leaders and the people who guide us forward. And that actually is a not so indirect pitch for my course in the spring, which will be entitled The First 100 Days, and which I hope some of you, if you have the time, will join us. It runs roughly from the middle of March to early May. It'll be an 8-week course. We are not going to have it here. We're going back to the more modest space in the Senior Center in Hanover. So there'll be room for 30 or 32 or so people, but I would hope to be able to see many of you there. And let me close by saying I want to thank you again for this terrific experience. I've had a really wonderful time. I wish you all happy holidays. I think Mr. Trump has made a campaign promise that everybody's going to have to say Merry Christmas. So Merry Christmas to all of you, and happy holidays. And I certainly hope we'll get to see one another again. Thanks.
Thank you.
Remember, I'm chair of the curriculum committee, and my good buddy up here is on it.